Posted by you/Yugathelizi. What's the scariest true story you've heard or told? One day as a kid I was exploring the forest near our house with my cousin. The forest was on a hill, but there were several craters there because of bombs that were dropped there during the World Wars, Germany. One day we saw a backpack at the bottom of one. We tried to climb down, but it was kinda steep and slippery, so we didn't want to risk falling. We planned on returning later with a rope, and went home. The next day news story was that there was a backpack found with the remains of a girl, in that forest. A guy walking his dog found it, after the dog wouldn't stop barking and going crazy at the edge of the crater, while staring at the backpack. We stopped exploring the forests after. One of my dad's friend's wife was murdered by some crazy dude walking down the street. This guy had just been released from a mental hospital and literally just stabbed her as she walked home. When my dad's friend came back he thought she had just taken the dogs out for a walk, so he walked along the normal walk route and he saw loads of blue lights. He was stopped by a police officer and wasn't allowed any closer until he saw that it was his wife. I met a guy who had been traveling Australia with a couple friends, hitchhiking around as many of us had done. One of his friend told him they were near his distant uncle's house, whom he'd never met before. He got a phone number from a family member and as they had hoped, the uncle offered them a place to stay. He picked them up in town and drove them out to his rural property way out in the bush. They said he seemed like a pretty normal guy, friendly and cheery. When it was time to set up a place to sleep, the uncle took them to a closet that was totally full of sleeping bags and bed rolls. They didn't think much of it at the time and all grabbed a kit and set up on the living room floor. They stayed a couple days and nothing out of the ordinary happened, and afterwards the uncle drove them to the bus station and they continued on their way. About a year later that man was arrested and charged with several counts of murder. He was the man who was picking up young hitchhiking backpackers and slaughtering them. The guy who told me this story was 100% certain he had slept in the sleeping bag of one of his victims. A few years ago I was living in a big city, didn't know anyone. A guy I was seeing came, from abroad, to visit me. At the end of his trip I accompanied him to his train home. After that I went back into the metro to go home. It was about 2 p.m., very bright and sunny outside. I sat down on a bench near a man. We made eye contact and I said hello, he said hello back. I felt like something was off but tried to ignore it. The metro car came and we both got inside. It was crowded. I took a seat, he took one of the only available ones which was right across from me. I started thinking I was overreacting since he started talking to a man near me, seemed like they knew each other. His friend got off after a few stops but he stayed. Once I saw my own stop approaching to change lines I got up. He got up too and was right behind me. I could see his reflection in the metro car window and he was very slowly looking my legs up and down. I started to feel very uneasy. The doors open, we get off. I start walking quickly to the end of the platform then realize he might be following me. There were several entrances/exits around so I suddenly changed direction to go to another exit. He changed course as well. Then I turned around again, he followed. I did this a few times and he changed his path to match mine each time. Fuck. Eventually I knew I had to leave somehow so he wouldn't catch up, so I went to the exit I needed to take to change lines and go home. Unfortunately the passageway to the next line was flooded with people so I was slowed down. He caught up with me and started crowding me in, getting closer and closer to me. I was backed up against a wall at this point, him just smiling brightly at me. "Hello, how are you?" he asked me, still inching towards me. I was terrified at this point. No one stopped to even glance at us, so I knew unless I did something myself I wouldn't get away from him. I glanced to the right and saw a staircase downwards. Without warning I sprinted away to the stairs. He was very caught off guard and it took him 2 or 3 seconds to start following me. I flew down the stairs and straight into a metro car. I turned around to see if he was close behind. He was sprinting down the stairs as well. Thankfully, the doors closed before he could get to the bottom and we pulled away. Surprisingly I had gotten onto the right metro line and direction to go home, not that it mattered much to me at the time. That incident and several others of men following me home or in the street make me paranoid when I walk outside alone. There have been several confirmed cases in a few different countries of people living in other people's houses unbeknownst to them. I believe one case went on for a couple of years. The intruder would wait until the homeowner would go to work and then sneak out and steal small amounts of food as not to be noticed. Well, eventually the homeowner did notice and couldn't figure out where his food was going, so he set up a hidden camera to record it. I can only imagine how scary it would have been to come home from work one night and sit down to watch the video, skipping through hours of stillness, to suddenly come across a person crawling out of your attic. And then the slow realization that that person is still in your house at that moment. And then the retroactive fear of thinking back to all the times you laid awake at night and heard a noise, which you just dismissed as coming from the pipes or the old wooden beams, but actually it was a fucking person just above you. It gives me the heebie-jeebies every time I think about it. The Lake Bodom murders are very scary. There are 4 teens who go on a camping trip in Finland. The next morning, 3 of the teens are found murdered, and one of them is almost dead and severely injured, but survived. No one knows who the murderer is today. 44 years later, the 4th teen, Nils, who survived, was accused of murdering them and gets sent to prison. But then he was released a year later, because there was little DNA evidence to prove this. And no good evidence to prove that he murdered them at all. However, there is circumstantial evidence such as he allegedly fought his one friend due to an argument and was drunk. Some say this could have ended in accidental and/or intentional murder. However, I personally highly doubt that Nils is guilty. I couldn't find much information on who Nils thought the murderer was. So my thoughts are 1, it's too traumatic for him to remember, or 2, he didn't recognize the person. Some other key suspects include the manager of the camp, who was known for being quite hostile, an ice cream vendor who admitted to the crime on his deathbed, and a man who lived only a short distance from the camp who claimed to be in Germany during that time. However, there is much doubt for his claim. There was a sketch released of the alleged murderer, who seems to be an unsettling picture of an older man. And you can find a photo of the man, who looks like the guy in the sketch, attending a police speech. My mom was stalked by a guy in her chemistry class. This was back in the late 70s, during her first semester at college. They were lab partners, and mom thought he seemed cute and nice, and was too shy at the time to ask him out, but she said if he'd asked her out, she would have went. They were friendly with each other in class, but their paths didn't cross outside of that since they were in different majors. As the semester wore on, however, she noticed he was often waiting for her outside of her other classes, the library, the student union, out in front where her dad picked her up and dropped her off. This continued into the spring semester. Puzzled, but not yet alarmed, she asked him how he always seemed to know where she was. He proudly said, "Oh, I asked the registrar's office for a copy of your schedule." My mom went to complain to the secretary who gave out her schedule, and the secretary blew it off because you guys are dating. Luckily, mom had already arranged to transfer to a different school for sophomore year, and spent the remaining time left avoiding him. She never saw him after that. But it wasn't over. Flash forward to grad school. Mom was at work, and grandma gets a knock on the door. Since the man at the door was in a naval uniform, and my grandmother was a Navy nurse, she let the man in, because he looked rather sad. He starts off by saying how sorry he is for my mother's loss, which completely mystified grandma. "Well, ma'am, I just got back from overseas, and I found out my friend recently killed himself. He spoke so highly of his fiancée, your daughter, and I wanted to meet her." My grandmother told him her daughter didn't even have a boyfriend at the moment, let alone a fiancé. It doesn't take too long to establish the man's deceased friend in question was in fact mom's stalker. The naval lieutenant was pretty upset, and my grandmother even more so. She made him leave before mom got home. The weird thing about the stalker's death is that it was ruled a suicide, but he hanged himself from a very high up tree branch you'd need a ladder to get to, and his hands were tied behind his back. From what my mother later learned, he had a tendency to snoop and generally stick his nose in places they didn't belong besides the obvious stalking thing, and this didn't win him too many friends, so it's anyone's guess who he might have pissed off. My mom always concludes this story kind of nonchalantly, like, yeah, back in those days, they didn't really know much about stalking. They've gotten a little better in terms of awareness now. It gives me the creeps to think what could have happened if he escalated his attempts to follow her after she left that school. When I was a little girl, 9 years old or thereabouts, I was playing at the school down the street from my house. It was the middle of summer and myself and a girlfriend were hanging around watching the boys play street hockey. One of the boys called my name and said a man in the parking lot was looking for me. The parking lot was mostly obscured by the building, but I could see an old 70s style van that hadn't been there earlier. I was walking over to the van when the mother of one of the other kids showed up looking for her son and asked me what I was doing. When I told her someone in the van was looking for me, she took my hand and started to walk with me and the van pulled out and sped away. Friend's mom walked me home and I wasn't allowed out of my yard without my parents for the rest of the summer. I was so upset and didn't understand why I was being punished. It was only years later that I understood that I was likely being targeted by some opportunistic scumbag for who knows what. Thanks Mrs. Gibson, wherever you are. This happened to me. This is from the days when I used to live back home, I used to live in Karachi, Pakistan but now moved to UK. We used to live very close to a SID, Police Investigation Department aka Pakistani FBI, building which we all were unaware of and always thought it was just an ordinary government building till on 11th November 2010. On that day around evening time coming home from work I thought I better hit the gym, because they had a sauna and after being tired from all day work that sounded like a good idea, which was hardly 0.3 miles away so I decided to walk to the gym. I change quickly and leave for the gym and start walking towards the gym. This is almost I've hardly walked like 10 minutes and I'm 0.1 miles away roughly and all of a sudden for a nanosecond I feel the ground is shaking and the next thing I hear is the loudest bang I've ever heard followed by a pressure kick into my chest. Now to let you guys know, both the ear started bleeding because the bang was so loud and for the reference the kick in the chest was as bad as Big Show wearing military boots and kicking you in the chest straight with full force. Next thing? I'm on the ground covering my ears because they are in agony and covered in dirt trying to figure out what's happening. As I am trying to figure out I can see all the car's alarms have gone off. Anything made up of glass has been shattered in roughly 1 to 2 miles area. I'm still trying to figure out what has happened and I start smelling gunpowder and as if someone is making a barbecue and is being burnt. I will always remember that smell which was something unsettling. Next things rock and dust particles starts landing on me and the surrounding areas which had 1 to 1.5 inches long of pieces of human skin and flesh. I am not believing that I have another human skin piece stuck to my arm. I brush up my clothes and arms getting up and covering my ear recovering from that pressure kick. As I move closer to a spot in a street where I'm hearing loads of people screaming and crying I see a few 3 to 5 feet cracks between some walls of the building which have been destroyed by the shockwave of the bang. I see the gap between a wall and move into the area where I see these scenes straight from a Hollywood movie where people are crying, cars on fire and dead bodies on the ground. By this time I'm thinking it's a bomb blast and that's what has happened. As I move closer I see a 10 feet and 30 feet wide crater which has been filled with the water and the building which was a SID building is no longer there. There are hundreds of people lying on the ground crying for help as some of them don't even have legs or limbs or some don't have their complete bottom. I am still in a state of shock looking around and I see a woman crying and hitting herself because she had her husband dead whose legs and torso was missing. I seen that later. I see several people without legs, brains out and no limbs. One thing, which haunted me for sure was a 18 to 20 years old guy who was dead and lying on the floor towards his chest on the floor with his neck turned towards me. I can still remember him looking straight into my eyes. His feet were flipped the other way around. After the police arrived and media arrived I came back home after it got crowded. After I came home after the dusk every day, I would see that 18 to 20-year-old boy standing and staring into my eyes. I would wake up screaming throughout the night and see that guy standing at the doorway just staring at me. For 2 to 3 weeks I would see this guy regularly during midnight standing in my hallway staring through my soul. I still remember that guy's face and the shockwave and the sound of the blast. P.S. To this day even the slightest bang or even a loud music drops freaks me out sometimes reminding me of that shockwave. I'm married so sometimes I tell my wife that the bang just reminded me of the shockwave I witnessed in this accident. I don't tell her but inside my heart I pray secretly that God don't ever put anyone through that even in their wildest dreams. I used to love swimming. I'd go snorkeling, scuba diving, even jumped off a few cliffs into the water. When I was about 18 I read the Necronomicon, the collection of Lovecraft short stories, not the real thing, had a good scare, giggled at how silly I was to be unnerved and went about my life. Next year went to Crete on holiday, first day I jumped right into the ocean with my dad and went out deep. Lo and behold, I feel something tickling my legs. I dive under to see since it's too deep for seaweed to reach this high and I wanted to see fish. Tentacles. Everywhere. I was so shocked I lost my air and panicked hard. I started breathing in water as glowing eyes, sharp beaks and suckered tentacles flashed about me. Thankfully, Dad got me to the shore and didn't understand what was going on. He'd seen nothing but suddenly had a really grim look on his face. Went to the doctors. Turns out I'm the victim of a family curse, schizoaffective disorder. My dad was horrified cause since he hadn't got it like his brother and mother, he thought I'd be safe. They caught it early but this revelation then led to a lot of aspects of my life being thrown in the air. Entire people in my life became false, ideas I'd had were delusional, outbursts revealed to be due to mood swings. I'm doing much better now, I still don't go in the water. I'm a crime writer and once interviewed a woman who told me an unrelated horror story about something that happened to her as a girl. When she was like 10, she had trouble sleeping and imagined the boogeyman was living in her closet, staring at her during the night. Every night she would come down and tell her parents and every night her father would tell her the boogeyman didn't exist and she should go back to bed. Well, This happened for several nights and the father got tired of it. So that night he walked her back to her bedroom, turned on the light, and said, "I'll show you there's no boogeyman," and went to open the closet door. But something on the other side held it shut. He sent his daughter out of the room and forced the door open to find that a man was inside. He'd been sneaking into their house every night to stand in the girl's closet and watch her, and maybe more. He beat the ever-loving shit out of the man and the man went to prison. When I interviewed this woman, I looked him up online. He'd recently gotten out on parole and had skipped out on his weekly checks. There was a warrant out for his arrest and nobody knew where he was anymore. My mom's best friend was driving home from work one night when she got pulled over from a police officer. She had no idea why, but figured it could be a tail light or something, so she pulled over. When the officer approached, he confirmed to her that her tail light was out, and asked for license and registration, so she gave it to him and he disappeared to his car for a while. Later, when he came back, he started asking her weirder and weirder questions. They started regularly: "Where are you going? Where did you come from?" But then they started getting personal. "Do you have a husband at home? Any children? Any weapons? Any daughters? Any aggressive pets?" Once he started getting concerningly personal, she told him that it was inappropriate to be asking these questions. Then he started getting aggressive. "I'm a fucking cop. Do you know what that means? It means you shut the fuck up and do what I say. Step out of the car." Obviously she was pretty scared at this point. She rolled up the window and started looking through her purse for her phone. At this point, the officer was straight up violent. He was pounding on her window and trying her door, yelling crazy shit. "Get out of the fucking car, you bitch. You dirty fucking slut," I said out. So, in a full-blown panic, she stepped on the gas and drove away. A chase occurred for a short while, but the cop quickly stopped following her as she got closer to the main road. She then called 911, where she learned that there was no officers that were supposed to be in that location. In the coming days it turned out that there was a rapist who was posing as a cop in that area. She never even had a broken tail light. But he had her address, her personal info, and even knew about her husband and daughter. She told him she didn't own weapons, so she immediately purchased a pistol. Unfortunately she was forced to live in fear for a while until they caught the man. A van of 6 people and a driver are on the way to an engagement. Lonely roads and the driver dozes off. He wakes up and realizes that the van has gone out of his control, and in the seconds he has, decides to save himself and jumps out through his door. Van out of control, runs down, tosses and rolls. 4 people in the van died on the spot. 1 lucky person survived with minor fractures. The other person had barely survived. She had her skull cracked, the bone under her eyes broken and caved in, glass from the window stuck to her eyes, the nasal bone broken, jaw broken and teeth fell out, shoulder bone broken and dislocated, hip bone fractured, toes broken and a huge chunk of skin gone on her feet. She was wheeled into the hospital and performed surgeries on. She said the only thing that got her through was thinking that her kids would grow motherless. When I saw her post-surgery, she was completely wrapped in bandages like the Invisible Man, gaps for eyes and a hole for lips. She couldn't speak for months and couldn't walk for a year. This was my mom and the year was 2006. I was 9 or 10 then, and the memory of her mummified form still haunts me in my dreams. When I worked in healthcare, I had a patient who got a sinus infection. He stopped taking his antibiotics after a few days because he felt better. His sinus infection came back with a vengeance. When he got to the emergency department, he was presenting with stroke symptoms. The infection had spread to his cranial cavity. There was so much pus that it was twisting his brain. No one thought he would survive the surgery. The family was advised to expect the worst. Amazingly, he actually survived. He ended up needing 3 more surgeries to wash out and spent almost 2 months in the hospital. Take your full dose of antibiotics, people. When I was about 5, woke up to my house surrounded by loud voices and bright white lights. A group of robbers broke into our house after some kind of heist and were using us as hostages with rifles. The police had our house surrounded. My parents, grandparents, and I didn't really speak English back then, so my 12-year-old sister had to translate the demands to the police and instructions to us. My grandma told me to go back to sleep, which I somehow easily did. I was a director of my college's student government. There was this dude who was always willing to take on projects, so I gave him lots of stuff. I remember thinking B was very charismatic and well dressed, and when he told me he owned a startup clothing company, I bought some stuff from his website. It was typical for student government kids to end up at the same parties, and I ran into him several times outside of committee. I was studying abroad my senior year and I was here on Reddit. Saw an article with the guy's face on it. Turns out he raped 12 girls at my university. It was apparently well known, but because his father was a dean wealthy professor, it kept getting swept under the rug. Apparently he was using extracurriculars like the student government to keep coming back to campus after he had been removed from his classes. Throwaway account, TW. I used to be in the police and this story is burned into my head, probably for the rest of my life. Got called out to a caravan park, lady could be heard screaming in one of the caravans the whole day, but we only got a call that night. I turned up to the address with my partner and a huge friendly man comes to the door. He was towering over me and completely blocked the entrance to the caravan so I couldn't see past him. I said to him there had been complaints of a woman screaming from this address and he told me that his missus and him had been arguing about something getting stolen from outside their caravan which was her fault. Bullshit story. He was the friendliest man and so nice to deal with. Unfortunately I wasn't going to leave without checking on the female as we have to make sure all parties are safe before leaving. He was hesitant at first but then moves out of the doorway and I see her sitting on the bed covered head to toe in clothing and huge sunglasses, which was odd because it was night time, possibility of drugs but I doubted it. I asked if she was okay and she nodded her head. She wouldn't remove her glasses for me and I wasn't allowed to make her. So I gave them a warning about the arguing and told them to keep it down. I was still unhappy with the situation as I didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest, so I decided to go next door and ask if they had seen anything. The neighbors told me the woman is covered in bruises and I need to get her to safety. They agreed to be a witness and make statements, so I was happy with the evidence for an arrest. I go back to the caravan and arrest the man and put him in the back of my car. I then go over to the woman who immediately collapsed when standing up. We help her back onto the bed and she starts removing the clothes and glasses. She's covered in bruises, her face is swollen with black eyes. She has fresh blowtorch burns to her legs and stomach. Huge holes all over her body from a screwdriver that were infected. I've never seen anything like it. That woman was tied up in that stupid little fucking caravan for weeks being tortured for every minute she was awake. The thing that got me though was how nice this monster of a human was. You just don't know anything about anyone until it's too late. We put this fucker away for life without bail. We got her help, a new place to live in a recovery house for domestic violence victims, and she's doing well. The saddest part of this whole story. The female is still in love with him and asks if she will ever see him again. Brainwashed. I'm not really great at writing sentences or paragraphs, but I hope that everyone can read this just fine. I was walking out of a Walmart one night and this guy caught my attention and asked me if I can get him a ride. I don't know this person and I don't give random strangers a ride. He told me he was a truck driver and he wanted to go back to the gas station across the highway, literally just within walking distance, so he can get to his big rig. I made up some BS excuse so I wouldn't give him a ride. I suggested to him that there's Uber he can contact for help. He starts yelling at me saying that it's just a ride and that he needs help. At that point, I just said I gotta go and I quickly turned around and headed to my car. I heard him say okay. I got into my car and sped off. Initially I felt extremely bad for not giving him a ride, but the way he yelled at me made it seem justified that I said no. I don't give strangers rides unless it's family or friends. Cut to almost a year later. I'm at a restaurant eating lunch. I decided to open up Facebook on my phone. What I saw next just spooked me down to my core. The article showed a picture of the same guy, who asked me for a ride that night, in a mugshot. Turns out he was a running fugitive wanted on several murder charges across the state I live in. One of the scariest things he did to trick people was that he would ask for a ride, and then when him and his victims were out of sight of everyone, he would then kills them by shooting them, and he strips them of their money and their clothing. He then would take their vehicle and travel to the next area to find his next victim. I legit almost choked on my drink when I saw that. It happened about 12 years ago. I'm a 39 years old anesthetist from Egypt. 12 years ago I was working in a small hospital in the rural city of Rosetta. If you know Rosetta Stone, this is the city where they found it. The hospital is formed of 5 floors. The dormitories are in the 5th floor. The ground floor had the emergency and causality department. Other floors have the wards, the labs and the operative theater. At that time the hospital was under some maintenance. In that particular day I was on duty. There was nothing in the operative theater that afternoon, so I was in my room in the 5th floor surfing the web on my netbook. I heard some knocks on the door. It was the janitor. He told me that some new beds and wardrobes would be delivered now. He asked me to stay out of my room till they finished the replacement. I stayed in the TV room for a while when suddenly the PA system announced my name to head immediately to ER. Before I moved, one security man came running and he told me that there was a big road traffic accident that involved a school bus and that everyone available is needed down. I rushed to my room, Found the new furniture in place, so I closed it and ran down to the ER. When I entered the ER department, I noticed the new color of the walls. Before it was green, now it's blue with silver decorations everywhere. While I was helping the children, I asked one nurse when they changed the colors of the ER, would all the hospital have the same pattern? She looked me confused and asked what new color. It was always like that. I got confused myself, but I didn't pay attention to that. There were many injured children. There were many doctors, pediatricians, surgeons, etc. A lot of them were new faces to me. I was working in this place for several years, so I almost knew everyone. I was asking myself when all those new people came. I should be more social and so, but I didn't expect anything bad. I was asking the people I know about the new doctors, and always I was getting the same answers. You don't know him? How? He was here for several years. We meet over lunch or dinner, etc. Again, I was confused, but I didn't pay attention. Thank God nothing was serious. No one was admitted to ICU or went through an emergency surgery. A couple of hours later, everything is fine and things began to settle down. So I went outside the ER to have some fresh air. I won't forget what I saw. The hospital place is near the Nile, the Western branch, the Rosetta branch, so that's what I usually see when I leave the hospital. But what I saw was simply the Mediterranean. Rosetta City is near the Mediterranean, but not that close. I couldn't believe my eyes. I began to look to the surrounding buildings. Some I knew, some I didn't. Now I freaked out. I remembered that I didn't recognize the ER or the new doctors. I ran inside to my colleagues and I asked them about what is outside. They told me it's the Mediterranean. I shouted, I know it's, but how did it come to here? Everyone was confused. I kept asking, where am I? And my colleagues started to calm me down and try to understand why the panic. I tried to call my parents. I was single at that time, using my cell phone, but they didn't answer. I wanted to call another older anesthetist. I consider him a father and my best friend. I couldn't find his name on my phone. I really freaked out. I asked my colleagues for his phone number. Everyone told me that they don't recognize the name. I was sure that I wasn't dreaming. I was treating children, calculating drug doses. My mind was clear enough to know that I wasn't dreaming. I got a mental block. I didn't know what to do. Then I decided that I will leave the hospital at once. I need to see my family. I ran to the 5th floor to my room to change my clothes and get my things before I leave the place. Once I opened the room, I noticed the usual furniture. No new furniture, no new bed or wardrobe. I stood there for a moment totally lost. Then I heard someone calling me. It was a security guard. He told me that there is a big accident down that involved a lot of children and they needed everyone down there. I kept staring at him without any response. He kept talking that PA is down because of a faulty maintenance and that's why they are calling the doctors individually. I told him that I will go down. He asked me if there is any other doctors in the dormitory. I told him that I don't know, so he went to check. I had a look outside the window and here it was the Nile and the usual scene. But I was already lost. I went down to help, the same children, same injuries, but I was completely lost, confused and hands shaking, my legs barely carried me. It was easy to manage the children since I knew them already. I knew what kind of injuries we will find. My colleagues, usual daily group, no more new doctors, asked if I was okay and that I was pale. The next few days was like hell to me. I had nightmares. I wasn't able to think clearly during my day. Then I took 1 week off to calm down. I have never experienced anything similar. I wasn't on any medications at that time or under any kind of stress. Everything was clear, it wasn't a dream at all. As I said, my mind was clear to pay attention to the details of drug doses, scoring of injuries. I'm sure. Till today I still remember the children and what I did to them. I only told this story to this older anesthetist and later to my wife because whenever I remember it, I remember that horrible feelings I had.